All right, welcome everyone. I'm Amanda, one of the owners and family mediators with San Diego Family Mediation Center, and happy to have you all here today. I am talking with Cindy Gatlin of Bridge North Advisors. Cindy is the founder and managing principal, and we're going to talk about the fear of the unknown today. And that kind of topic came about, thank you to Cindy, with the idea that especially when you're going through a divorce, the fear of what you don't know, of the unknown, can be what is most scary for a lot of people. And especially, a lot of the clients that Cindy works with, especially women that she's seen. So I want to give Cindy the chance. Cindy, if you can introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself and who you work with and all that.
Got it. Thank you for having me, Amanda. I really appreciate it. I'm Cindy Gatlin, founder and managing principal of Bridge North Advisors. I am a wealth manager and a financial planner for clients. I started off in the industry, well, I've been investing for 30 years, but I became a wealth advisor over a decade ago. Part of the impetus for me to become one was I was widowed 13 years ago, so I know a lot more about this from a personal aspect, and I can understand a lot of the emotions that go on either via divorce or widowing. What I would say in all this is what I've seen in my experience from the clientele that come to me, really and truly, what you don't know tends to be your greatest fear. Once I break down the finances with clients, they can always absorb whatever that information is. So the reason I had that title today was I really think not knowing is worse than hearing the worst case scenario.
I think that's a really good point, Cindy. I know that I think that's what I hear a lot from my clients is, that they don't know and they're unsure and, how, and sometimes if they haven't been the one who's dealt with finances during the marriage, how do they kind of get started and what do they do? So we're going to talk about a couple of the different areas that I think are most important when it comes to kind of the finances in divorce. And, one of the things is, in mediation, we are talking about finances, right? We're talking about assets and debts, we're talking about support, all of that. But one of the things that can be really helpful to clients is having someone like Cindy to talk with through the process. And I know that sometimes you might have a financial advisor already, but I think sometimes too, especially when it's a couple, both might not feel comfortable with that person. So I don't know, Cindy, if you can talk a little bit about kind of how you've worked with clients, whether they've been current or new ones during that divorce process.
So that's been my experience too. Frequently, women during the divorce process or definitely afterwards will say, I was never very comfortable with my financial advisor. They didn't include me in those conversations. I was entirely kept in the dark. Or in the worst case scenario that I have from a client, I'm smiling because it's so horrible. I'm sharing it, but also really irritated for her. She had a financial advisor who always said to her, oh, I forgot, the reason you aren't understanding this right now is you need to get your morning cup of coffee, and then you'll be able to absorb the financial information I'm giving you. And that was such a condescending attitude, right? My heart went out to her, and I thought, why in heaven's name would you continue to work with that person? The other problem outside of the emotional realm of it is I see a lot of clients have a financial plan that's basically whatever they had before their marriage just carved in half. And that doesn't work for many reasons. Frequently, this is going to be your nest egg. Well, previously you might have had growth, in other words, increasing that portfolio as your primary objective. And now your primary objective has to be what's called capital preservation. So you don't want to lose the nest egg, because I've also had a lot of people, unfortunately, come to my practice too late who found out the hard way that capital preservation should have been their number one goal. So if you keep your finances with the old financial planner, there's something you really need to focus on, which is to point out to them, one, women live on average 5 to 6 years longer than men. In my case, they actually live 10 years longer. That's my family history. 2, you're probably going to have more expensive medical costs. 3, women on average only earn 81% of the man's dollars. So what that says, again, is whatever you take out of that divorce, you really need to preserve, because chances are, even though the two of you might have been on the same path together, you're probably going to end up earning less going forward. So we really want to focus on the nest egg.
Yeah, that's really important and good to know. I think that a lot of clients, one of the conversations you and I have had, made me realize that not all advisors are really looking at the portfolio with clients and really understanding what their goals are. That a lot of it is just much more, well, this is what they've always done, so we'll just leave it that way. And I think that the other thing, when you talk about the woman at the beginning who, the way that the advisor treated her, I think oftentimes too, though, it keeps women from going to other advisors because they just kind of, the process feels icky is the only way I can kind of say it.
Yeah. So, and I will be one of the first to admit that Wall Street has a reputation, sometimes rare, right? Like you're thinking of the guy from Wall Street, greed is good, etc. And so if that's your vision of what my industry is, it's understandable that even though you're in a bad situation, you might be concerned about finding an even worse situation. But again, that's the fear of the unknown. You think you're going to find something worse, but what most people aren't counting on is they can probably find something better, more suited to them. You don't know what you don't know, which is why I always advocate, go out there and get a second opinion. I know it's time consuming. I know it takes effort, but let's face it, that time you might have been using in the evening to Netflix, maybe you should actually get a second opinion, because what you do today has ramifications for the rest of your life. And I can't emphasize that enough. Let's talk about a couple of statistics which might give people some comfort. The stock market on average, if you use like the last century, I would argue the averages have changed recently, but we're looking for a long-term trend. You can expect 5% a year return. So if you have 100,000, that means at the end of the year, you should have 105,000. If you start compounding this, what can happen is in 20 years, you can triple your money. So you can take 100,000 to close to 300,000 because you didn't touch it. And every year you reinvested that 5% growth. Well, that's a tremendous number, right? And all you had to do was get compounding interest, or in other words, reinvesting your dividends or whatever the growth was, et cetera. But if you decide to instead take that money and turn around and spend it on something which I would argue won't have as strong of a return, like perhaps the family home, which you shouldn't earn, you're in this fork in the road, and you took what was probably emotionally the stronger response was, hey, I want to keep my home. But if you look at it standing back, you might actually say, no, you know what? I know I'm going to be living for 45, 50 more years. I need to make this tough decision now, because I know that if I stand this way, the next 20 years, I'm going to have triple what I currently have. And again, that's an example. Yeah. I don't want to say that will definitively happen. We might also have what's called the lost decade, which was 2000 to 2010, where stocks basically just kind of stayed even. No one has a crystal ball. And I want to emphasize that, I always do. But then again, I've been doing this for 30 years, and at a certain point, you start recognizing trends. And one of my favorite things to talk about is tulip bulb fever. So that was a thing back in the 17th century in Holland, where people were spending crazy amounts of money to buy tulips. Till all of a sudden that bubble popped. You could argue the dot-com bubble was just another version of the tulip bulb fever. But having said that, if you have a long enough time horizon, chances are you will make money in the stock market.
Yeah. So I think that's an interesting point. And one of the things I want to talk about when you brought up kind of the making money in the stock market, and you also brought up the home, right? So I think that one of the big pieces when you're going through a divorce, one of those main areas is the division of assets and debts. So, from my perspective, being the mediator or attorney, California is a community property state. So what that means for anyone who might not know is that, anything you acquire while you're married can be split 50-50 when you divorce, unless it was a gift, inheritance, or, you had it before marriage, or you had a prenup. But for the most part, anything you acquire while married. And so what happens though is that doesn't mean we're necessarily dividing every asset right down the middle. Maybe some people do. But a lot of times what I see is that there are certain assets that one person wants to keep and certain assets that the other might. And so one of the things that I see often is one person, and oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes that is the woman who wants to keep the family home. So I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about kind of what do you see, is that a good kind of decision for them to make? And what are some of the things that you talk through with clients when they come to you with, this is what I want to do?
Okay, so I'm going to preface my statements by saying I've spent 17 years in Texas. My dad's from Fort Worth, so I'm going to call it the pig versus the cow. And that should conjure up an image for you. Most women have a tendency, and I don't enjoy being stereotypical here, but they do tend to pick the pig, and the men pick the cows. So what's the pig? That's the thing that hogs your money up. It looks fun on the front end. Generally speaking, that's the house. versus the cow, which is typically someone's business or earnings or even something as simple as their stock accounts, right? So typically when it comes to the division of property, I will see women choosing the house over what could be an income producing asset. Now, I understand you can argue there's going to be equity in the property. That is true, but there are also taxes, running costs, maintenance costs. It can be a very expensive proposition and not one that they're necessarily financially well suited towards. You throw in emotions and the fact that your kids were born there or raised there and you don't necessarily want to change their household. I understand why women choose the house. But from a strictly financial perspective, that's not necessarily their best choice. You might say, hey, look, I'd really be more like, I'll sell the house. Let's just divide up the equity now. I'll go find a new house, but I want half of the 401k because I know that that could be an income producing asset down the road. Everyone's going to have a different situation, but I just want to advise everyone who's looking at a divorce, try to identify the pigs versus the cows, because at the end of the day, the pigs get slaughtered for their bacon.
It's a great analogy, Cindy. It's not one that I heard before until you and I had spoke. But I think it makes sense to me because, I think that there's so much, and I get that too. There's so much of that emotion oftentimes tied into the house. One of the things though that I talk about oftentimes with clients is it all good emotions that are tied to that house? And oftentimes, I was speaking with a client the other day and she goes, we've lived in this house for 4 years. Only about 2 of those have good memories. She's like, so at first I was fighting so hard to keep it, but then I realized maybe I'd rather start fresh and maybe I'd rather, sell the property and then be able to go purchase something new. And I said, yeah, something that can be just yours and the kids. And I think that on the, separate from the financial side of it, that's something that can be important too to think about is, do you really want that house? And oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes what I'm seeing is that's a big house too, right? It's a house you had for, full family, and maybe it's even more space than you needed as a family. But, is that the size house you want when it's you and the kids, and even sometimes just you? And I think that that's something that not always thinking through and figuring out what that looks like. So, I think there's 2 pieces to it, but certainly on the financial side, being able to understand what does it look like. And I like to say, not just in the short term, but what does it look like long term? Like what's that going to do to your, and I think you brought that up a little bit, but maybe you could speak to that a little bit more is, how do you kind of get clients to understand it's not just the, 1 or 2 years right now, but it's what is it going to look like in 10 years?
So I have the advantage of charts and math on my side. So what we can do is we can chart out for you if you took the money out of the house and let's say you're going to get 100,000 in equity out of the house, and yet you'll still go buy something cheaper, you're going to live on it, et cetera. Now I take this 100,000 again, I show you what it can grow compounding using an average interest, right? In the last few years, we've been blowing away the averages, but you can't presume that's going to continue. And 2020 has certainly shown us that nothing's for certain. Where I'm going in this, though, is we're not looking for day-to-day trades when it comes to someone's divorce or long-term investments. We're looking at long-term trends. So if I show someone, look, if we make this decision today, in 20 years from now, you'll now have this much more saved on the side. Is it really worth keeping that house to you, knowing that in 20 years, we can fairly accurately predict you're going to have X, Y, Z in terms of a dollar amount? Don't you think you will be comfortable when you're older having more liquidity? Think of yourself as a 20-year-old, think of yourself as a 30-year-old and a 40-year-old. Most of us dial down our risk as we get older. That trend will only continue. So if you think about what you choose today, chances are you're going to be even more conservative in 10, 15, or 20 years. And chances are your future self will thank your current self for doing something that is in your own financial best interest, even though it might be hard giving up the house. The other thing I'll point out to you, which I've found to be a pleasant surprise with a lot of my clients, they've had to sell what they thought were their big houses, their dream houses, the ones they built with their spouse. And let's say, for example, it was a Mediterranean style house. I've had people who said, okay, you've made me see the way. I'm going to sell the house. I'm going to take the equity out. I'm going to buy something cheaper. And hey, the kids are, let's say, in their mid-teens anyhow, so they'll be out at college relatively soon. I've had people go from buying a Mediterranean house to a stark, modern, minimalist house. Absolute night and day, right? And I've had clients come back to me and go, you know what, that was really fun. I never would have thought I'd be this person, but my realtor brought me there and it's all kinds of excitement and it's a new project. And so people have been pleasantly surprised. What they thought was going to be a really difficult maneuver, like ripping off a Band-Aid, ended up being a joy for them. And so I've experienced enough of those changes that I can use the examples when I talk to people and say, hey, you know what? It might end up turning out better than you think. The one thing I can guarantee you is if you're in a very expensive house that you can't afford and you're just going to try to hold it for the next 3 or 4 years, you've really handicapped yourself and you're underestimating the amount of emotional pressure you're going to be under. You think you're doing it for your kids, but what your kids really need is for you to be a happy, present parent. And you can't be there if you're really worried about how much the mortgage is costing you, telling the kids to turn off the lights every 5 minutes to save the electric bill. That sort of low-grade stress really eats away at people.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And something that I talk about often with clients because it is that stress of what is, how does it look like financially? If you're literally, just making it, what happens when, something breaks in the house? What happens when you need to replace something? And, it's also, kind of, we'll talk a little bit more on the support and the income side of things, but when you're talking about, being realistic about what the costs are, being realistic about what is it going to look like. And, the idea that if something can go wrong, it will, right? So you've got to plan for that. You've got to be able to know, like, not just living day to day, but how are you going to, maintain that household and, what is that going to do for the kids? And, I know a lot of times when they talk about, when I hear from clients is for kids is staying in a school district, right? And I get that. I totally get that for kids, wanting to stay where they are. But I think that sometimes there's a way to do that without having to keep that house, right? And so, really looking into the options. And, I think what you said is something, a conversation I have with clients a lot is, I'll say to them, like, you're not going to be able to see it right now, right? To you, this is the worst thing that ever happened. If you didn't want the divorce, you're going to, very upset about it and very like, how can this ever get better? I was like, but it will. I was like, you will see, and it may be a few months, it may be a few years, everyone's different, but you will get to that point where you can look back and realize, wow, I made it through this and I'm better. I'm better off. I'm happy where I am. And part of that is figuring out the finances, certainly.
I'm also going to point out that I think parents, I know that there's a lot of change and trauma going on for the children, and I understand that. I want to respect it. I also want to emphasize to parents that sometimes I think we are too worried about what our kids can and cannot adapt to, and we're transferring our stress onto them, right? It's our concerns. If your child is in love with their school and makes that quite clear, that's one situation. But if your kid's kind of like, I'm not really good friends with so-and-so, or, if they're older and they've broken up with a boyfriend, they might not be as adverse to moving school districts as what you are presuming they're going to be. So if the kids are old enough, I think it's certainly worth having a conversation, a very direct conversation with your kids saying, look, here are our choices. We could stay in the school district. I didn't want to because of you, but tell me if you feel otherwise. Because I've also seen people make decisions without involving their children, and you might be surprised what the answers are that come from your children's mouths. So I would really advocate strong communication with children.
I think that's a great point. Especially when they're teenagers, right? When they're at that age. I spoke with someone recently and, she, after having a conversation with the kids didn't want to stay in the house. Like, they actually wanted to move. They wanted to be able to start fresh. And, there was just a lot of issues, a lot of memories there. And so, when you've got teenagers, it's not putting them in the middle. It's never, making them choose anything, but open communication about what you're thinking. They may surprise you, and they may, like you said, have an opinion that you didn't quite realize that's what they would think. So
with one of my clients, sorry for that. With one of my clients, what I said to her was, your children are 15. If you told them you were going to sell this house, you're going to move to another one. In this case, it was still the same school district. But that would allow you to take more money and put it into their college saving plans and thereby reduce, because the father does not necessarily have to pay for college, et cetera. It depends. Every situation's different. But I said, why don't you talk with the kids and say, would you be willing to go rent a place? I'm going to invest it. Part of it's going to go over here. because the mother said, look, in 3 years, I don't need to be here anymore. Well, 3 years is a short enough time frame. You may or may not want to buy a house because you might be caught on the backside in a market downturn, kind of like, the Great Recession of 2008 was. So 3 years is a rather short time horizon for owning a house. And in this case, the children said, we would much rather just go rent someplace, stay here for the next 3 years, and then mom gets to go wherever she wants to go. And then mom took the accompanying funds and put it into a 529 for her children. So again, that's why I talk about there are many different ways to work around it. These are older kids we're talking about when they're younger. I know that younger kids crave stability. I have a 6-year-old at home, and that's always, of course, my first and foremost goal. And at the same time, I also want to talk about that sometimes children do better in life when they experience a little bit of adversity. I'm not talking dramatic, but they need to also see that life's not always perfect and that you're trying to put things together in place, and involving them in the decisions, even at a young age of 6, gives them a sense of control and ownership, which is also something they need at this time. If you've involved a child psychologist, you probably already know that.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And it really is about understanding what's best for the kids, different at different ages, and what are you doing? And I think that, ultimately it's not, when we're talking about the house, it's not that you can never keep it. I think it's ultimately getting the advice and the financial knowledge to know whether you can. And there are certainly situations where people want to and they can, and there are certainly situations where they want to and they can't. And so I always think it's very important to do that before, this is going to be my lawyer mediator hat, is, do that before you agree to anything. Don't put yourself in a position where you've now taken on this home and you've given up other assets that you should have maybe looked into, and you can't go back and change anything. Because that's the biggest thing, when we're talking division of assets and debts, that it is finite.
So that's another topic I want to touch on, which is most people, when they look at a portfolio, when they're dividing it during the divorce or the mediation, they'll say, hey, I just want to split it down the middle 50-50. Well, it's not quite that simple. You've got retirement accounts, cash accounts. You might have an inheritance, which is completely off the table in this case. But what will happen is, let's just say it's a cash account. Okay, we won't even make it complicated and make it a retirement account. And let's say you've got, again, using easy numbers, $100,000 in that account. People will then say, well, it's as simple as let's do 50-50, right? 50,000, 50,000. Well, it probably isn't that easy to divide up that way. You might have, and I'm going to use crazy stocks. Please do not take this as a solicitation to buy or sell, etc. But I'm going to use names everyone knows. My lawyer would kill me if I didn't say that. So Tesla, let's say you've got like 20 shares of Tesla and you have 10 shares of Apple. Well, most people will say, oh, Tesla looks amazing, so I'm going to go, I want all 20 shares and then my spouse can have the other 10. Really and truly, the best way to divide a portfolio up is to take all the shares and divide it in half. I don't think most people should start nitpicking for individual equities. If it's not what you do every day, then please do not become a do-it-yourselfer. That's the easiest way to get burned. The initial rule of thumb should be taking every stock and splitting it half and half. And you might have something like 376 shares, and it becomes complicated for your financial advisor, but that's why you have a financial advisor. Don't sit there and start cherry picking the equities. First of all, the lawyers are going to have a heyday on that. Because then it will become a negotiation. Do I get the 10 shares of Tesla? No. How about you do 6 shares? I do 4 shares. Split every equity in half. And yes, you can literally divide an equity share. You can start dividing them in half. That's very complicated. We're not going to go down that road. But I would strongly recommend that, because what I've also seen is sometimes people will say, I have 100,000 over here in a Roth IRA. I have 100,000 over here in a taxable account. Those are not the same. Okay, sorry, I should have used 401k. You've got pre-tax money, you have post-tax money. Pre-tax money means it still has to be taxed on the way out. And I've seen either lawyers make the mistake or individuals who I don't expect to necessarily know the difference saying, oh, there are 2 accounts, they're at 100,000, we'll just swap them out. Well, no, they have different tax rates. So it's really important for people to take note of that. That's why I say every account you have, just split it. Every equity, divide it in half. Otherwise, you will spend a lot of money on the attorneys debating who gets exactly what equity. And at the end of the day, chances are you're not going to keep that portfolio anyhow. Chances are you're going to sell out most of it. But then you have to talk to your accountant about the tax implications of that. Otherwise, if you sell the whole portfolio, come year end, you're going to have a tremendous tax bill, which you may or may not be able to absorb. So with most of my clients, I say, okay, how much tax can we absorb this year? For example, we're going to sell out 1/3 of your portfolio this year. Next year, although we're mostly through 2020, what I would do in this case is I would sell out most of the portfolio, say in September. January is only a few months away, and you'll sell out another third. Well, you've basically cleared out 2/3 of your portfolio in just a few months, but the taxation is very different as a result of it. Mm-hmm. I can really get caught up in taxes. I'm a recovering CPA.
Yeah, no, it's those are really important points though. And one of the things I was hoping to talk about, because, and it's not just like, I always say the clients, that you shouldn't necessarily know that unless you are a financial advisor or you're very involved, in that. You shouldn't, it's not necessarily common knowledge to know, okay, these types of accounts are different, right? But that's where you want to make sure you have the right professionals, right? And unfortunately, I've seen far too many lawyers, like you said, who also make that mistake. And so, understanding that your attorney might be a wonderful attorney, but they might not have the financial training and background. And so making sure that you're working with the right professionals do. For us, all of our mediators are CDFAs, which is a certified divorce financial analyst. So I always say, I am not a financial planner. I'm not giving you financial advice, but I understand when you need to talk with someone. And I'm able to say, these accounts aren't the same. So why don't you make sure that you discuss that with your advisor of how to divide them? Now, one of the other things we're seeing a lot more now, and maybe Cindy, you can talk to, is, should you agree on an amount from that account, or is it a percentage? What's happening with the fact that, from, beginning of the year to now, we've seen a lot of up and down and volatility in the market that can affect those accounts, right? So, how do you how would you work with a client on how they should do that?
Well, that's why I advocate splitting the shares up, not on dollar amounts. Because let's say you split it up on dollar amounts. You take $50,000, $100,000 account, and you give each person 50-50, but you didn't give them exactly half of each equity. Well, let's say one account, again, using crazy examples, has a lot of biotech in it. Biotech has rallied this year. Well, what you originally agreed to only a few months ago, or even maybe just a few weeks ago, what was originally a $50,000 account has now maybe rallied up to $60,000, right? So you've gotten what's a 20% increase there. So 50 to 60 in this case is 20%, but I digress. Whereas the other individual, let's say they were perhaps invested in something like utilities. So the 50,000 might have dropped down to 48,000. What was originally a 50-50 split has now become two very different portfolios just because you didn't split each equity directly in half. You chose dollar amounts as the means to divide the property. That's not the right way to do it. You need to literally divide each equity in each account, because that way you get your equitable share of both pre-tax and post-tax dollars. And that way, if anything rallies or conversely, if anything declines, you're both participating in that. Because if you start just breaking it up based on dollar amounts, what I see is the more financially spouse will always take the equities that they think are going to rally. Typically they're right, not always. And they'll say, well, I only had that stuff over there for diversification. I'm going to keep this over here because this divorce might go on for a while. We've already agreed to this, whatever the reasons are. And at the end of the day, that only causes more resentment down the road. I'm a big fan of trying to minimize the emotion or the negative emotions that one can feel towards their spouse. And trust me, I have been there. I have walked down this road. But at the end of the day, if you had children, it is always important to come across as fair and equitable to the other side. It doesn't look good on you, nor does it look good on the spouse, but most importantly, it hurts the children. If you don't have children, I still recommend the same strategy. If you're out there dating and you speak poorly of your ex, the person that you're potentially going to date is going to sit there and go, man, that's a bit of a red flag. So no matter how you slice it or dice it, you always want to speak well of the other half. And one of the ways you can speak well is if people feel things were divided equitably and reasonably.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely a good point. And, making sure that, you're dividing those accounts in the way that you do walk away with what it should be. And, because a lot of time is passing, that's why, what Cindy's talking about dividing those equities instead of a flat amount is really important. Otherwise, I've also had clients who've tried to say, well, we'll just come up with the amount as close to possible as the division date. Well, then you're spending money on someone like me who's having to continually recalculate where are those values and things like that. So doing it in a way like that is really important. And then keeping in mind, what are those pre-tax versus post-tax assets? What does that look like? And that's really important to think about when you're talking about all the division of the assets and what those different types are like. So I realized I didn't say at the beginning, anyone watching, if you do have questions or comments, feel free to put them into the comments. And then if there's any questions, we'll certainly make sure that we address those as we go on. So I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about support. So I know, exciting ones. So we've got in California or in most states, but California is what I'm going to talk about. We've got child support and spouse support. And so if there are kids, child support is a guideline formula. It's based on the time you each have the kids, and it's based on income. So child support isn't really the difficult one. It modifies over time, and then it ends when the kids are 18 and have graduated from high school. Where I think that there's much more that can be worked on with a financial advisor is spousal support. So maybe if you can talk a little bit about what are some of the fears or issues that you've seen come up with clients around the support side, and how do you work with that?
Ooh, talk about an emotionally charged topic. I get asked my opinion frequently from clients, and I'll say, look, I've seen this go a few different ways. And then you taper your answer to that particular scenario. So I'm loath to give rather blanket advice outside of I will give this because this drives me nuts. If you're going to do spousal support, I usually try to ask for things to be pegged to CPI, Consumer Price Index, right? I know that not always can people go back in a court of law. I came out of Texas many years ago, and sometimes people would go back for child support. And I know we're supposed to be talking about spousal here. But I would advocate to both sides. I'd say let's try and peg whatever the payments are to CPI. Now, typically the primary income producer will say, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to have to voluntarily give up 2% a year. But that's really short-term thinking. If you peg it to CPI, Consumer Price Index, every year there's going to be a little bit of a bump up. What does that do? Well, that provides the lower earning income spouse a bit of a raise, you might argue, but I would say it's actually just keeping pace. But more importantly than that, it means you're far less likely to go back into a court of law down the road. And I think everyone, generally speaking, wants to avoid that, or in this case, it could be mediation. But regardless, I'm almost willing to bet you that that little 2% increase or whatever percentage you come up with will be less costly than the legal fees, the court filings, etc. And it just keeps everyone, again, happier. So when you are doing those handoffs with kids or having to meet them somewhere in public, in other words, you bump into them at a restaurant, you're more likely to be, friendly is too strong of a word, but let's just say polite to one another. Now, going back to what you were talking about spousal support, this one can also be very emotional because I've seen, again, the primary breadwinner will say, I've worked for 25 years. I flew all around the world. I gave up my evenings, my nights, my weekends. This is mine, mine, mine. Flip side of the equation is you presumably, if not in writing, you did have an agreement that someone would stay at home, raise the children, make sure they went to class, go to the dentist appointments, etc. on time. So although I understand someone might have spent the majority of their time on a plane growing a business, you both did this together because otherwise your lifestyle would not have occurred. How you divide that up equitably is a challenge. And I do know emotions get brought up into it, but part of what I will always say to either side that I represent, there is another side of the scenario. And then what used to always amaze me but does no longer is I used to say to people, how can you hate someone so much when at one point you loved them and you want to spend the rest of your life with them, and then you even had children with them? This is, the parent of your child. Try to remember that sometimes. And I think if you remind people of that, or you try to remind them of some of the good times, the emotions can get dialed down because it's far too easy for everyone to just spin into a downward spiral of making their soon-to-be former ex-spouse, Satan's spawn.
Yeah.
That was strong. Yeah.
I know someone who I love. Joey says, love your children more than you hate your ex. And, really the idea that you need to focus on putting the kids first, even if you do hate your ex at this point, find a way to do what's, best for loving the kids first and foremost.
Right. And then the spousal support, I really want to remind both sides that this was a partnership you went into. A marriage is a legal partnership. So even though you might have felt you did X, Y, Z, the other side also feels they did X, Y, Z. Without the two of you working together in conjunction, you would not have arrived to the position you're at today, albeit they're divorcing. you wouldn't have had that house, you wouldn't have had those children, you wouldn't have had everything that you own unless you'd work for it together. So sometimes I have to remind people of that. And then they'll look at me and they'll say, you're not my attorney. And I'll point out, well, I'm also not your psychologist, but I'm trying to remind you to keep these things in mind, because finances tend to be a relatively easy discussion by comparison. I can break down the math and show you what's the most equitable route, but few people will agree to that because the emotions get caught up in it. So the one thing I always recommend to my clients, because a divorce or even mediation of a divorce can go on for months, if not years, and it's important to remind people to dial it down, because no one wins when everyone gets that upset.
Yeah, no, that is very important to realize, because yeah, you've gotta think through what your emotions and figuring out what that's going to look like. I thought one of the things we talked about that was interesting as well was some statistics about what happens income-wise with gender, right? So post-divorce, and maybe some of the ways that people can think about that, right? So not, again, I think what you said at the beginning is very important. Every situation is different, and it's always going to depend on what does the income look like, what has gone on. But maybe talk a little bit about some of those statistics we talked about, because I think it was.
So the first statistic I'm going to tell you is for women under the age of 50, and then I'm going to tell you the after 50, because there is a stark difference between the two. And I'm going to read this because I want to make sure I get my numbers right. It came from the London School of Economics. So again, I always want to know what my sources are for my statistics, because that can validate whether or not I want to use them. But the London School of Economics found that when marriage, during their marriage, and after their marriage, they experienced a 20% decline in income. So even though they continue to work through all three stages of life, pre-marriage, during marriage, and after marriage, nonetheless, women received a 20% reduction in their income and presumably their lifestyles. Interestingly enough, men experienced an income rise of 30% or more post-divorce.
That's crazy.
And Amanda said she's heard this statistic before.
Yeah.
And it's shocking. And you could argue why this is wrong on so many levels. But again, it goes back to women earn 81 cents on the man's dollar. I don't really want to get political in this. What I want to point out is the math speaks for itself. So I think sometimes the fear of not knowing if they'll be able to maintain their current lifestyle will keep women in a marriage they wouldn't otherwise want to be. I think sometimes women come to the realization that their lifestyle will change. And the sooner you can accept that, the easier this process becomes for you. And I really, really want to strongly emphasize that. And then I want to talk about the women over 50, because it's a stark contrast. For women over the age of 50, your income drops by 41%. So that's almost double, right? And then for men, their income, this is interesting, their income drops 23%. So I don't know why over the age of 50, the men's income decreases, unless you start saying, well, in middle-aged people tend to peak, and then after that, then they're just looking at assets, right? So it might be that men, if they get divorced in their 50s or 60s, just go, I'm not going to hit the gas pedal as much. I don't know what the underlying root cause is. I just find it interesting to know these statistics. Mm-hmm. Now, for some women, they might say, hey, look, I've been working my whole life. I worked, took a couple years off for the kids. A 20% reduction is something I can certainly handle. So those statistics might be liberating for other people, because they might be thinking, oh, I'm going to get a 40, 50, 60% drop in income. I also want to remind you, a statistic is just that. It's an average, so it's only as good as the numbers that are put into it. So you might be an outlier, right? Like you might only lose 2% of your income. Conversely, you might lose 60%. Everyone's situation will be different. An average is just, I don't want to get into the math. It's just an average.
Yeah. I think it's interesting too to think about in relation to the whole how you're getting divorced and what you're doing moving forward, right? So one of the things that the way I look at it is, yes, it's what you're earning and that, but it's also everything else in your life that's affecting what you're earning, right? So one of the things, I said is it's possible that, men are actually seeing an increase and women are seeing a decrease at the younger ages if, who's taking on more of the child raising responsibilities. And that's not always, certainly there's many situations, there are certainly a lot of parents who have 50-50 and that, both are, but there are situations where the mom has the kids more. And so if she is responsible for so much more of that, I could see that affecting income, right? I could see that being, one of the pieces. And so, I think it's an important conversation to have that, one of the things I always say in mediation is everything is intertwined. It isn't just, okay, support's over here, assets are over here, and your kids are here. It's a puzzle. That's how I look at it. It's all different puzzle pieces, and we want to figure out how do those puzzle pieces all fit together, because they are all related to each other. And if you don't think about one in relation to the other, then it's not all going to work together. And I think that's sometimes where, attorneys, might not be as, in mediation, we really want to look at that whole picture, because it is all going to affect your life.
Right. And I agree with you. It's a really messy puzzle. You can't pull any one piece out of it without bringing down the whole house of cards. So everything is a negotiation. I also want to point that out, which the majority of Americans do not like negotiations. I happen to be in the minority. I thrive off them. I enjoy them. I find them intellectually stimulating. But when it came to going into family court for my own child, I didn't love it. When most of the time I'm the person who, I actually enjoy buying a car. I love negotiating with them. So, hey, I've also taught my daughter that skill from the age of 3 onwards, to the point that people are in shock of her. I think she's amazing. We'll see how she turns out. Where I'm going in this is everything will be a negotiation. So you just kind of have to brace yourself for that. And it's the long road. Something else I want to say, and I'm plugging my industry here. I would wrap a financial advisor in more or less around the time you choose to separate. And here's why. You may or may not have to pay them for your advice. You might say something, if you know them well, hey, at the end of the divorce, I'd like you to manage my assets. Could you do a financial plan for me? Can you do X, Y, Z? And here's why you want to wrap my industry into the equation. You might be looking at taking a divorce, and let's use some crazy numbers. You were going to take the $10 million home, and he's going to take a $10 million portfolio. And I can show you how that house will appreciate over the next few years, but your running costs are going to cost you this, and your property taxes are going to cost you that, whereas the $10 million that he's walking off with will actually end up spinning out to this. I can create a financial plan that shows you both avenues, and then a compromise or a hybrid between those two, where you sell the house and then you take $5 million of the portfolio, right? You guys both share the proceeds of the house, go off and buy your own new properties. When people see those actual numbers, then they can make a real decision. If you're just dealing with, theories or ideas of what the house is worth, no, we're going to wrap in a real estate agent who works in your neighborhood, who tells you, no, I feel fairly certain we're going to get this dollar amount. Great, go list it. And then again, when it comes to the equities, it's these minutiae which can really have tremendous financial ramifications. Again, someone takes the $100,000 401k, that's still got to get taxed, versus the person who took the $100,000 post-tax money. Huge financial ramifications. Once you make these decisions, generally speaking, you can't go back and undo them. So it's really important you have someone who represents you on your side, for both the husband and the wife, or if it's same sex, clearly for each person of each gender. But I want to point out, you need to have your own financial representative in addition to your attorney. A lot of people will assume the attorney is financially astute on these topics. And generally speaking, forgive me, Amanda, I found that's not necessarily their strong points. They're good at mediating. They're good at telling you your expectations. They're good at giving you ideas, but they don't necessarily know exactly how to divide up the finances. And that's where you should get a financial advisor involved. Worst case scenario, they run a financial plan for you. But again, now you know what your options are. It is far easier to make a decision saying, hey, I know that in 20 years, this is going to happen to me, or I can choose option B, and in 20 years, this is what happens to me. It's based on the unknown that people make too many decisions, or it's based on the here and now. So in other words, they go, well, at least I know what the house is and I'm living in it. So it has a double benefit, which I agree, but you can also accrue that benefit in another house. So I want to point out to people, I think too many people don't wrap a financial advisor in early enough.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. It's something that we always advise of our clients, because I think another thing that a financial advisor can help with is something that you said about, it's a negotiation, right? And a lot of clients, no matter who they are, don't feel comfortable negotiating. And it's not even a gender thing. I think that I see it across the board, because this is somebody that you were married with, you have this relationship with, and negotiating with them can be can be awkward sometimes. It also brings in all the past stuff that has happened in your relationship, and that's how you're gonna, them. And so what I find is involving a financial advisor, gives them oftentimes the knowledge and the wherewithal to feel more empowered when they go into those negotiations, and sometimes even can bring in that financial advisor into the negotiations, right? And so they don't have to do it alone. And so I think that that's also really important, is knowing that you can use that person to make sure that you're making the right decisions. And that's why it needs to be someone different, most of the time for you and your spouse, because you're going to look at things differently, and you're going to, you'd have different advice maybe for clients, whether you represent one or you represent your spouse. So it's very important to keep that in mind.
But I've also seen where one spouse, called spouse A and spouse B, both have their own financial advisors. And let's say I represent spouse B and will be kind to spouses A's financial advisor. I think I've nailed everything for spouse B, and financial advisor for spouse A goes, oh, we should do this, that, this. And I sit there and go, you know what, that's brilliant. I hadn't thought of that. Sometimes you will find more heads in the game. Now, there is a point at which you get declining returns on that, right? Like if we have 5 or 6 financial advisors, it's too much. But every once in a while, you'll sit there, and over the years, I have learned from other financial advisors, but now I've reached a point where there really isn't much that I feel I haven't seen. So I can give advice to the opposing side where I say, hey, look, I know you're looking at it from this lens, but look, you and I are not in this divorce, sir, ma'am. We're both just the financial advisors. Did you think about the economic impacts from this angle? No, you didn't? Okay, well, I wanted to tell you that. Do you mind conveying that to your spouse? Because I think that you agree with me, it's a fair situation. So I want to point out that everyone should have their own financial advisor, not simply to represent their own interests, but sometimes you get an overlap of advice, which is helpful. And if nothing else, our advice is not, generally speaking, $550 or whatever your attorney's charging you an hour. Generally speaking, we can come up with different plans. We'll either say, hey, we're going to spend X hours creating a financial plan, or you've told me you're going to become a client at the end. Great. So feel free to spend a little more time with a financial advisor, because I know with an attorney, people are frequently just worried about running up the clock. And this is one time where, generally speaking, you can get a few hours for free that will make a tremendous impact on the rest of your life.
Yeah. And one thing I want to say that's really important is making sure that advisor understands the divorce process. I know that Cindy does, and I know many advisors that do, that I refer to during the process, but some don't. And it's not that there's anything wrong with them as an advisor. They may just not have had clients that went through divorce, or they may not have focused on that area. So, it's really important to understand what they're, how comfortable are they with that. And if you have an advisor that you want to stay with, maybe you want them to continue managing your assets after the divorce, but they're not good in the divorce, in the process, that's okay. You can find somebody who will work with you just on the divorce piece of the financial advice. And so know that you can have both when it comes down to it.
And I'm glad you brought up the expertise, because I think that's really important. In my practice, we actually on the website have a section for divorce so that people can click on it and learn some more information about the financial ramifications of a divorce. We have a checklist in there. We also tell people, hey, here are the expectations, how you should divide property. We don't get too specific because, again, the lawyers wouldn't love that. We reserve that for when we meet clients. But I think there's a great part on the website that tells people, we don't expect you to know this stuff. If you haven't gone through a divorce previously, you don't know what's in front for you. But here's some information that'll give you guidance and give you a stronger comfort level. And when you have a stronger comfort level, you have more confidence. And when you have confidence and you're not stressed out, people make better decisions. And so that's my end goal for my clients, is to give them that confidence and a comfort level so they make the best decisions for them. Look, I'm not saying every time you should sell the family home. That isn't the case. That's usually the majority of the cases, but not every time. So again, our advice on the website will give somewhat generic, but I do think they're really helpful checklists, especially on items which Amanda and I talked about. After you divorce, there are still items you need to execute financially, particularly if you go into a second wedding. Your children from the first marriage might run into trouble, so we need to make sure your house is in order. How about I leave it at that?
Yeah, and it's we'll make sure I'll have Cindy let us know, how to best find her online and stuff. But we'll also put that into the comments so that anyone who's looking for that information can find it. But I think as we've got a few more minutes today, that kind of the checklist is one thing I'd love to touch on real fast, because I think that a lot of times people, they get that marital settlement agreement signed, and then they think they're done, right? There's nothing else, and that's all they have to do. And it's really important to know that there are so many more things to do. And so Cindy and I have talked, because we send our clients as through mediation a checklist at the end, but she's got a great one on her website as well, that is, keeping in mind what else should you do, and knowing that a lot of attorneys and mediators aren't going to follow up with you after the fact. We try to with our clients. We've got some stuff we do because we know this is what happens, but a lot of them are just, once you're done, you're done. And so make sure that you get everything done that needs to get done, because there can be lots of ramifications in the future if you didn't divide accounts, or you didn't take care of qualified domestic relations orders, quadros for your retirement accounts, things like that. So I don't know, Cindy, if you want to add anything that you see.
Yeah, let's use an easy example. Let's say in one case, I'm the spouse and I have a 401k, and we agreed that 401k is all mine for whatever reason that is. It was the division, or maybe it was mine before the marriage. But at some point during the marriage, I said that my spouse should become my 100% beneficiary should I die. Now, I've divorced that individual, but I forgot to take him off the 401k. Well, here's the problem. If I go die somewhere, you might say, oh, her estate, her plan will actually cover this, or her QDRO, like whatever you think the documentation that it has it covered probably doesn't, because you actually have to change it with the plan administrator. And so what may end up happening is I thought, oh, I divorced that individual. The money will now go to my kid because, I got it in one of these legal documents. You actually had to have changed it with the plan administrator, because they run off of their documents. And if you haven't changed it, I've actually seen that happen where people had money go to a spouse that they had divorced. And I know that wasn't their intention, but it's just what ended up happening. So when I tell people it is fine and dandy to come up with all these legal documents and the division of property, unless you execute, it didn't happen necessarily. So it's really important that you execute and you tidy up these items. And I know most people just kind of want to sit back and go, oh, I made it through the divorce, I'm on the other side. But you still have to tidy up the loose ends, or else you didn't really solve the problem.
Yeah. No, it's really important. We've seen that happen too. Exactly what you're saying. They don't change them. And along with that is, maybe you agreed to something in your divorce that needs to be done correctly too. Maybe it is that you are going to leave your ex-spouse for a certain period of time, or you're leaving a certain percentage. So making sure too that you follow what your agreement says, because there may have been legal things that you agreed to that you need to make sure are done correctly. And that's for both spouses to make sure it's done correctly, right? If you're having, if your ex-spouse is supposed to leave you as a beneficiary for their pension or whatever, check and make sure that that's been done correctly, right? So it's just making sure that all of that information is done. And I'll just say a caveat from the legal side. Also, make sure you're not doing these things before you've signed your agreement and finalized your divorce. Because there are certain restraining orders that go into effect on the financial side. Just make sure that you're not making any changes that could kind of get you in trouble with the divorce, but then make sure that you do them when you are supposed to. So I know it's kind of that like, well, you told me not, but make sure the timing of when you do it is important as well.
I'm not advocating sneaky behavior. First of all, I don't personally approve of that. But secondly, I think that tends to come back to you, because I've seen that happen in some individual divorces, maybe not as much in mediation, but when people actually went and worked their way for many years through the legal system, and then they end up getting dragged back in because one spouse decided to do something we'll just term it as naughty. I have seen that backfire so many times. I would never, ever advocate doing that. I mean, your word should be your bond. One of the easiest ways around this I've often discovered is if people are getting caught up on dollar amounts, I say, great, let's buy an insurance policy. Those can be relatively cheap, and say, look, if you're worried about the kids, et cetera, we'll put it towards the children. If that is the easy solution, then let's do insurance, because that will also take away a lot of the emotion in a battle. So That's another topic, another point. But I wanted to remember to say that to people, that you can sometimes use insurance as a unique tool for saying, but wait, when he passes away, I'm wondering about this, or if she passes away, what will happen to the children? You can just say, oh, well, let's just get a life insurance policy on them, and we already know it will go to the children. And that can really remove a lot of tension in the negotiations.
Yeah, and that can be owned by, you can own it even if it's covered on you're covering your spouse's life. And so that's one of the ways too, where if you want to make sure it's being paid, if you have concern, it's just, there can be ways to kind of cut down on some of that conflict too, post-divorce. And so there are, those are some good ways that you're saying. So we are almost out of time today. So I'm going to kind of wrap us up, but Cindy, thank you so much for joining me today. This is such great information. The finances, I mean, we could talk for much more time on them. There's so much that goes into it, but I think that you shared some really great information. And I know that, that'll be great for people to know. Maybe if we can kind of wrap up and think, what would you say? I know we kind of talked about it, that it's the unknown, right? It's the, what's going to happen? Is there, besides that, is there kind of a biggest financial fear that you see when you work with clients?
It's fear that their lifestyle is going to change. Most people don't want their lifestyle to change. Inevitably, everyone's lifestyle changes. The sooner people are able to absorb that fact, usually the easier this process becomes for them. It is very unusual for both sides to have so much money that they can continue to live their lifestyle they previously lived. And it's when I see people fighting to do that, that causes a lot of tension for them. And if they just sat back and said, maybe I don't need that big of a house, maybe I could go rent, or this, that, this, if people could just change their expectations, particularly on the front end, that makes the process a lot faster and easier. Because if you are not willing to accept a lifestyle change, then you're in for a battle, which you may or may not win. And that's true for both sides. I'm not picking a side in this equation. I think everyone needs to adjust their expectations and say, we had 2 people before, now we're going to have 2 households. We are now going to have 2 retirement accounts. Everything just got more expensive. So unless you have extraordinary sums of money, your lifestyle will change.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good point, and thank you for sharing that. So as we wrap up, Cindy, like I said, I'll put it into the comments, but what's the best way for people to find you either online or to reach you if they, had questions or wanted to discuss stuff?
I think the website's probably the easiest. It's www.bridgenorthadvisors. Advisors has an O in there. I didn't realize people would ever spell it with an E, but they do. So bridgenorthadvisors.com. You will see it here in San Diego, California. It is not the Texas group. You can go to the website and you can get my email, our phone numbers, but I think the website is easiest for people to explore, learn a little bit more about myself and more about the company, and make a decision where they'd like to go from there.
Yeah.
Thank you. They spelled it correctly.
There you go. Yes, we've got it. And if anyone has questions or mediation, if you're looking to reach out to us, you can find us at sdfmc.com. We're always happy to speak with anyone who might be thinking about divorce or going through it about mediation. And if mediation isn't the right fit or you need other advisors, we're always making those introductions as well. So again, Cindy, thank you so much for joining me today, and hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thanks.
Yes. Thank you again, Amanda. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.